Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a huge topic, how the world spiraled into World War II. Our goal here is to look way beyond just, September 1st, 1939 and the invasion of Poland. That's the trigger, sure. But we want to dig deeper, go back decades, really, to unpack the ultimate failures, the system breakdowns, and the specific aggressions that basically made it all inevitable.
Exactly. And I think for you, the listener, to really get a grip on this, it's useful to separate things out. We talk about ultimate causes. These are the long-term problems, the treaty issues, the diplomatic mess-ups, the deep historical wounds. And then there are the proximate causes. Those are the specific actions, the invasions, the aggressions that popped up one after another in the 1930s.
Right. And when you look at that whole period, say 1918 right through to 39, there's this massive contradiction, isn't there? This paradox of peace. We just had the war to end all wars. There's this big Wilsonian dream of collective security, a League of Nations, a kind of government of governments. How did that vision just completely fall apart?
Well, the problem was it was kind of flawed from the get-go. The world didn't really buy into Wilson's big global idea. What they chose instead was what some historians call a peace of victors. It was all about payback, really, security for the winners. And that immediately sowed the seeds for, well, deep resentment, instability, and this powerful drive for revanchism, wanting to get back lost land and lost pride.
Okay, so if we're pinpointing where that ultimate failure really begins, you kind of have to start right there in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. This is supposed to be the peace settlement. But for Germany, the new Weimar Republic, it felt less like peace and more like, well, a punishment. It put all the war guilt entirely on their shoulders.
Yeah, and that moral blame was incredibly damaging, politically destabilizing. But it wasn't just symbolic. The actual practical terms of the treaty were, brutal. Geographically, Germany was essentially carved up. They lost something like 12% of their pre-war land and population. All their overseas colonies, gone. Instantly. Plus, they were specifically forbidden from unifying with German Austria, the Anschluss, which is kind of ironic, given the Allies were supposedly championing self-determination.
And the military restrictions. They were designed to basically make Germany powerless, weren't they? Almost laughably so on the world stage.
Oh, absolutely. The German general staff dissolved. No tanks, no military aircraft, no poison gas, no heavy artillery. We're talking an army shrunk down to about the size of Greece's, a navy comparable to Argentina's. It was total demotion. But maybe the thing that stung the most day to day was the demilitarization of the Rhineland. That was all about French security, but it left Germany's western border totally exposed. It screamed, "You are not an equal."
And on top of all that, the money. The reparations. This huge bill that Germany was expected to pay. The Allies needed the cash for their own debts, but they also had to sell this to their own people.
Right. The initial figure was enormous, something like 6.6 billion pounds. How they got to that number is actually quite revealing. During the talks, President Woodrow Wilson, he insisted that the reparations bill had to cover pensions for Allied war widows and orphans.
Wait, Wilson? The idealist. Why would he push for that? I thought his advisors were against it.
They were, because logically, pensions have nothing to do with the physical damage Germany caused. But politically, adding them in helped justify the massive total sum to Allied populations, particularly the British and French, who had suffered huge losses. It basically doubled the bill, setting up this impossible financial burden. And later, when the Weimar government tried to pay striking workers during the Ruhr occupation by just printing money, well, that led to hyperinflation. It completely wiped out middle-class savings and totally discredited the democratic government in the eyes of many Germans.
So you've got economic chaos, a fragile democracy, this deep sense of national humiliation. It's the perfect storm, really. And this environment is exactly where that poisonous idea, the Dostos legend, the stab-in-the-back myth, could really flourish.
Exactly. Because the German army wasn't obviously defeated on the battlefield, right? They marched home in relatively good order. So extremists, especially the Nazis later on, could peddle this lie. We weren't beaten by the enemy. We were betrayed. Stabbed in the back by the November criminals, meaning the democratic politicians, the socialists, the Jews, anyone who signed the armistice and accepted Versailles. This myth became a core part of Hitler's appeal.
And it's worth remembering, Germany wasn't the only disgruntled party. Italy felt cheated too, right? They were on the winning side but didn't get all the territory they were promised.
Absolutely. They were promised places like Fiume and Dalmatia, didn't get them, leading to huge national frustration. And Japan, their proposal for racial equality at the peace conference, rejected. So this peace of victors actually managed to alienate not just the losers, but key members of the winning side too. It was problematic from day one.
Yeah.
Hashtag, tag, tag, tag 1.2, the failure of the international system.
Okay, so the peace treaty itself is ticking like a time bomb. What about the mechanism designed to prevent future wars? The League of Nations. Wilson's big project. This was supposed to be a whole new way of doing things, collective security instead of the old, messy balance of power alliances. But it was, well, hobbled right from the start.
Fatally hobbled. And the biggest irony, the United States never joined. Wilson couldn't get it through the Senate. He'd been really rigid about Article 10, the bit that basically committed the U.S. military to defending any member under attack. The Senate balked, partly partisanship, partly that old American tradition, Washington's warning against entangling alliances.
So the League's main architect, its most powerful potential member, just isn't there, leaving Britain and France, who were totally exhausted by WWI, to try and make it work. Did they not see how weak this made the League? Why didn't they try to, I don't know, fundamentally change it, knowing the U.S. wasn't coming?
That's a really good question. I think partly exhaustion, partly focusing on their own problems, maybe just a failure to grasp how dangerous the situation really was. They sort of stuck with the original model, even though it had these massive flaws. Like, the League had no army of its own. It completely relied on member states agreeing to impose sanctions or send troops, which, surprise, surprise, they were often very reluctant to do.
And the other big one, decisions had to be unanimous, right?
Right, unanimity. Meaning any single country could block action. It just paralyzed the whole thing, made it toothless. And its failures became glaringly obvious in the 1930s.
Let's talk about those moments. The first big test was Japan invading Manchuria in 1931. What did the League do?
Well, it talked for over a year. Then it produced a report condemning Japan's response. They just walked out of the League in 33 and kept Manchuria. No consequences. Then came Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, Ethiopia in 1935. We'll get into that more, but again, total failure. These events basically taught aggressors, 1, the League is all talk, no action, and 2, you can get away with invading other countries.
So instead of this new world order, this government of governments, the absence of real enforcement, just let the world slide back into, well, international anarchy. Back to the old ways of alliances and military buildups. Hashtag, tag, tag 1.3, the tide of expansionism and extremist ideologies.
Exactly. And that vacuum wasn't empty for long. It got filled by these really powerful, aggressive, militaristic ideologies popping up in Germany, Italy, and Japan. These weren't just about national pride. They were fundamentally about expansion, about the state needing to grow, needing to conquer territory, seeing military strength as the ultimate goal.
In Germany, the core idea was Lebensraum, living space. This wasn't just about getting back land loss of Versailles, was it? It was much bigger, much more.
Oh, much more. Lebensraum was fundamentally about conquering territory in Eastern Europe for 3 main reasons. Get land for German farmers, destroy Soviet Bolshevism, which they saw as a mortal threat, and, crucially, establish Aryan racial dominance over people they considered subhuman, particularly Jews and Slavs. The Nazis framed history as this constant racial struggle, Teuton versus Slav, fighting for resources. So for them, war in the East was always going to be a war of extermination, not just conquest.
And Mussolini in Italy had his own version, didn't he? Spazio Vitale, vital space.
Yeah, his big dream was creating a new Roman Empire, controlling the Mediterranean. It mirrored Lebensraum in claiming a kind of natural sphere of influence for Italy, justified by history and, of course, military power. He played on that post-WWI sense of Italian grievance we mentioned.
And then halfway across the world, Japan had its own expansionist idea, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Sounds almost benign, doesn't it?
Yeah. The slogan was Asia for the Asians. The stated goal was economic cooperation and kicking out Western colonial powers, Britain, France, the U.S., the Netherlands. But in reality, it was about Japanese economic and political dominance over East Asia. An empire, just like the others, masked in anti-colonial language.
What seems different about Japan, though, is how militarism took hold. It wasn't just one charismatic leader, like Hitler or Mussolini, imposing their will. It seems like the military itself had structural power.
That's a really key point. 2 things made Japan unique and volatile. First, this thing called the Cabinet Law. It basically gave the Army and Navy ministers a veto power over forming a government. If the military didn't approve of the prime minister or the cabinet, they could just refuse to provide an army or navy minister, and the whole government would collapse. And that gave them immense leverage over civilian politicians.
Yeah, okay. And the second thing, you mentioned Gikokuju.
Yeah, Gakukuju. It roughly translates as the low overthrowing the high. It was the sort of ingrained culture, particularly among younger radical army officers, of acting insubordinately. They felt justified in disobeying orders, escalating incidents on their own initiative, like in Manchuria, or even assassinating senior officers or politicians they thought weren't aggressive enough, weren't pursuing Japan's destiny properly. This created this constant atmosphere of intimidation. Civilian leaders were basically scared of their own military, and it all kind of climaxed with the February 26th incident in 1936, a failed coup, but with lots of assassinations, which really cemented the military's grip on power.
Right, so we've got the backdrop. Versailles resentment, a failed league, these aggressive ideologies bubbling up. Now, the 1930s, this is where things really start moving fast.
Oh.
Hitler, in particular, developed this really effective diplomatic strategy, didn't he?
Chillingly effective. It was a pattern. Make a demand, often framed as correcting an injustice from Versailles, something that might seem almost reasonable to some outside observers. Then, threaten more if the demand isn't met, pocket the concession when the other side backs down, which they usually did early on, and then, almost immediately, start lining up the next bolder demand. Rinse and repeat.
And the first really big test of this, the first major breach of the post-war order, was the Rhineland, March 1936, sending troops back into the demilitarized zone.
Exactly. A direct violation of both Versailles and the Locarno Pact, which Germany had actually signed voluntarily in 1925. And we know from historical sources, Hitler was basically bluffing. His generals were terrified, the German force was tiny, they had orders to pull back immediately if the French army moved. They thought this was it, a disastrous preventive war.
But the French didn't move. Why not? They had the military superiority right then.
They did. But neither France nor Britain was psychologically ready for another war, or financially ready. And politically, it was tricky. Hitler was, after all, just marching troops into Germany. It was hard to sell a war to stop that. So they hesitated, and Hitler got away with it. It was a massive propaganda win for him back home, boosted his popularity immensely, got like 99% approval in a later vote. And crucially, it made France look weak, maybe even like the aggressor for even thinking about stopping him. Hashtag 2.1 Italian invasion of Abyssinia and global flashpoints. And almost overlapping with the Rhineland crisis, you have Mussolini making his big move, the invasion of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was often called then, starting in late 1935. This was pure old-school imperialism, building his new Roman Empire.
And the League of Nations, predictably, it condemned it. But what teeth did that condemnation have?
Pretty much none. They did impose some economic sanctions, but they were weak. Critically, they didn't include an oil embargo. Why? Well, Britain and France worried that cutting off Mussolini's oil might cause his regime to collapse, potentially leading to chaos, or maybe even, they feared, communism in Italy. And adding insult to injury, the U.S., not being in the League, just kept selling oil to Italy anyway, business as usual.
So the one thing that might have actually hurt Mussolini, an oil embargo, never happened, which led to that really poignant moment at the League.
Yes, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. He went to Geneva and gave this incredibly powerful speech warning the delegates, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." Killingly accurate, as it turned out. Italy conquered Ethiopia. Mussolini openly mocked the League as a farce and eventually pulled Italy out. The lesson for aggressors everywhere was crystal clear. Aggression pays.
Okay, so after these major blows to the international system, we get the Spanish Civil War, kicking off in 1936. This often gets called a dress rehearsal for World War II.
In many ways, it was. You had Germany and Italy actively supporting Franco's nationalists, sending troops, equipment, testing out new weapons and tactics. The Germans, for instance, used their Condor Legion aircraft for things like the bombing of Guernica. On the other side, the Soviet Union supported the Republicans, the Western democracies, Britain and France. They stuck to a policy of non-intervention, largely ineffective. And the outcome? Franco won. Fascism seemed to be winning across Europe.
And while all this is happening in Europe, war is also exploding in Asia. The Second Sino-Japanese War starts in 1937.
Right, triggered by the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. This quickly escalated into a full-scale invasion of China by Japan, brutal conflict, establishment of puppet states like Manchukuo and Manchuria, horrific events like the Nanking Massacre, and this relentless Japanese expansionism started to really alarm the United States.
Which brings us to a really critical factor for Japan. Resources, or rather the lack of them.
Exactly. Japan was industrializing rapidly, building this huge military machine, but it was resource poor. It needed coal, iron ore, scrap metal, and most importantly, oil. It imported almost all of its oil.
So when Japan started pushing further south into French Indochina, that's when the U.S., Britain, and the Dutch decided to act, the ABCD line.
That was the breaking point. The U.S. froze all Japanese assets. Then, crucially, the US, Britain, and the Dutch East Indies, which had the oil fields Japan desperately needed, imposed a total oil embargo. Suddenly, Japan lost about 80% of its oil supply. This was economic
It
strangulation.
basically forced their hand, didn't it?
Yeah.
They had a stark choice.
A brutal choice. Either they retreat from their conquests in China, which was politically impossible for the military leaders, it would mean total loss of face, probably their downfall, or they seize the resources they needed by force, specifically the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. And that meant attacking south, which inevitably meant conflict with the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. That embargo really locked them onto the path to war in the Pacific. Now, just to add a layer of historical debate here, something you might find interesting, is the discussion around why Germany went to war precisely in 1939. It's called the Mason-Overy debate.
Okay, intriguing. We know Hitler wanted war eventually for Lebensraum, but the timing, what did Timothy Mason argue?
Mason, a British historian, argued for what he called the Primat der Innenpolitik, the primacy of domestic politics. His theory was that by the late 1930s, the Nazi regime was actually facing a serious internal economic crisis. All the massive spending on rearmament was causing the economy to overheat. There were labor shortages, especially skilled workers, and crucially, he argued, the living standards for ordinary German workers were starting to fall, causing discontent.
So Mason thought Hitler was worried about unrest at home, like another 1918 revolution that brought down the Kaiser.
Exactly, haunted by that memory. Mason argued that Hitler was essentially forced into a flight into war in 1939. A sort of desperate smash-and-grab operation, invade Poland, seize its resources, plunder foreign assets primarily to prop up the German economy, keep the workers happy, and prevent internal collapse. In this view, the war wasn't perfectly timed according to Hitler's grand plan. It was almost forced on him by domestic economic pressures.
That's a really interesting take. War driven by economic desperation. How did Richard Over respond to that? He argued the opposite, right? Primat der Außenpolitik, primacy of foreign policy?
Overy, another prominent historian, agreed the economic problems were real, but he argued Mason seriously underestimated the Nazi state's ability to just repress any dissent. They had the Gestapo, the SS, they could handle worker unrest. Overy maintained that the decision for war in 1939 was driven by Hitler's long-term ideological goals, the pursuit of Lebensraum. The timing was chosen.
So, for Overy, invading Poland wasn't about escaping a crisis, it was about accelerating the plan.
Precisely. It was about speeding up the four-year plan, the plan to get Germany ready for a major war. Seizing Polish resources, Czech gold reserves, foreign assets. This was all part of the strategy to fuel the war machine for the bigger conflict Hitler envisioned later, especially against the Soviet Union. For Overy, it was a deliberate choice driven by ideology and foreign policy ambitions, not a panicked reaction to domestic problems. It's a classic historical debate, structure versus agency, economics versus ideology. Shows how complex these questions are.
Okay, so whether it was driven by economics or ideology, the pace definitely quickens in 1938. Hitler makes his next move, Anschluss, annexing Austria in March.
Right. This was a core Nazi goal, uniting German-speaking peoples. It was done under the threat of invasion, but actually there was significant popular support for it within Austria itself. Lots of cheering crowds. And crucially, Mussolini, who'd actually stopped an earlier Anschluss attempt in 1934, now did nothing. The Rome-Berlin axis was in place. Italy was now Germany's ally. Austria was left totally alone. Another bloodless victory for Hitler.
And no sooner is Austria secured than Hitler turns his attention to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland.
Yep, the border region, home to about 3 million ethnic Germans, but also crucially a home to Czechoslovakia's main defensive fortifications and a significant chunk of its industry. Czechoslovakia had a good modern army.
And alliances with France and the Soviet Union, they were ready to fight, weren't they?
They were. But then came Munich, September 1938. The absolute low point of appeasement. Britain and France, led by Chamberlain and Daladier, met with Hitler and Mussolini. They agreed to Hitler's demand for the Sudetenland. They basically forced the Czechs to hand it over. Hitler gave his word famously that this was his last territorial claim in Europe.
And Czechoslovakia wasn't even invited to the conference deciding its fate, just presented with the outcome.
Exactly. Utter betrayal. Chamberlain flew back to Britain, waiving the agreement, claiming peace for our time. But what Munich really showed was that Hitler's threats worked, and that Britain and France would sacrifice other nations for a temporary fragile peace. A disastrous lesson.
A peace that lasted, 6 months? Because in March 1939, Hitler just broke the agreement completely.
Completely. German troops marched into Prague and occupied the rest of Bohemia and Moravia, dismantling Czechoslovakia entirely. Slovakia became a separate puppet state. This was the final straw. because now Hitler was taking territory that wasn't primarily German. He was just grabbing land. It proved he couldn't be trusted, that his ambitions went far beyond just revising Versailles. This is the point where British and French policy finally shifts. Appeasement is dead, they realize war is likely coming, and they need to draw a line. Hashtag 3.2, the Polish fuse.
Right after Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, Mussolini makes his own move, doesn't he? Invading Albania in April '39.
Yeah, Mussolini was apparently worried Italy was becoming the junior partner in the Axis. He wanted his own dramatic success, so another independent nation swallowed up. It just reinforced this sense of Axis impunity. And now, the focus shifts decisively to Poland. Hitler starts making demands. He wants the Free City of Danzig, which was technically under League of Nations administration, but was overwhelmingly German ethnically. And he wants extraterritorial rights across the Polish corridor, that strip of land separating Germany from East Prussia, to build a highway and railway link.
Poland refuses.
Yeah.
You saw what happened to Czechoslovakia. They knew giving in would just be the first step towards becoming a German satellite state.
Absolutely. And we know from Hitler's own comments to his generals around this time, Danzig wasn't the real issue. He explicitly said, "Danzig is not the objective. It is a matter of expanding our living space in the East." Poland had to be crushed to open the way.
So this time, Britain and France don't equivocate. They draw the line.
They do. After Hitler issues his demands and Poland refuses, Britain, and soon after France, gives Poland a guarantee. Then, in August 1939, they formalize it with the Anglo-Polish Agreement of Mutual Assistance. An attack on Poland means war with Britain and France. The stakes are clear. But then comes the final, stunning twist. August 23rd, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
Ideological enemies suddenly making a deal. How did that happen? Stalin must have felt cornered.
He definitely felt suspicious of Britain and France. He suspected they were trying to push Hitler eastward, hoping Germany and the USSR would destroy each other. Britain and France had also been quite slow and hesitant in their own negotiations with Moscow for a potential alliance against Hitler. Hitler basically came along and offered Stalin a much better, much more concrete deal from Stalin's perspective.
Which was avoid a two-front war for Hitler and for Stalin.
For Stalin, it bought him time, he hoped, to rebuild his army after the purges. And crucially, it came with a secret annex, a secret protocol. This is the really cynical part. The secret protocol literally divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence.
They carved it up.
Literally, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, even parts of Romania. They drew lines on a map, agreeing who would get what when the territorial and political rearrangements happened. Poland was explicitly partitioned between them.
So this pact wasn't just about non-aggression. It was an agreement to jointly dismantle other countries.
Precisely. And for Hitler, it was the green light. He was convinced Britain and France wouldn't actually go to war over Poland, especially now he had neutralized the Soviet Union. He famously dismissed the British and French leaders as tiny little worms who wouldn't dare fight. He thought Munich proved they would always back down. With the Soviets on side, he felt secure. The invasion of Poland was set.
Okay, so the final trigger. The invasion itself needed a pretext, didn't it? Germany couldn't just invade. They needed to look like they were responding to something.
Right. Standard procedure for aggressors. This was Operation Himmler. And the key part was the Gleiwitz incident, staged on August 31st, the night before the invasion. SS commandos, dressed in Polish army uniforms, faked an attack on a German radio station right near the border in Gleiwitz. They broadcast a short anti-German message in Polish to make it sound like a Polish provocation.
And they left evidence, didn't they?
Yeah, the grim part. They brought along concentration camp prisoners, dressed them in Polish uniforms, shot them, and left their bodies at the scene as proof that Polish soldiers had attacked and been killed. The code phrase to confirm the operation had started, apparently, was, "Grandma has died." Chillingly mundane.
And the next morning, September 1st, 1939.
Dawn. Germany invades Poland. The Luftwaffe bombs Polish airfields and cities. The old battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which was visiting Danzig on a supposed goodwill visit, opens fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. World War II in Europe begins. Britain and France issued an ultimatum: withdraw from Poland or face war. Hitler ignored it. On September 3rd, they declared war on Germany.
But Poland was fighting on two fronts almost immediately, wasn't it?
Yes. As agreed in the secret protocol, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east on September 17th. Their official excuse was that the Polish state had collapsed, and they needed to protect the ethnic Ukrainian and Belarusian populations. Between the German blitzkrieg from the west and the Soviet invasion from the east, Polish resistance, though fierce in places, was overwhelmed. Warsaw fell at the end of September. There was even a joint German-Soviet victory parade in Brest-Litovsk.
And the aftermath for Poland was just horrific. This wasn't just occupation, it was planned destruction.
Absolutely. This was Lebensraum in action from day one. Poland was wiped off the map. Western parts were annexed directly into Germany. The rest became the so-called general government, run by the infamous Nazi lawyer Hans Frank. It became a laboratory for Nazi racial policies. Jewish ghettos were established almost immediately. Mass executions of Polish elites, intellectuals, priests, politicians began. Slave labor was imposed. We even have diary entries from German generals like Holder recording the explicit plan right at the start. No intention of ever restoring Poland, keep the standard of living brutally low, systematically eliminate anyone capable of leading resistance. It was nakedly exterminatory. Hashtag 4.2, the War of the West and the Battle for the Atlantic.
So Poland is crushed, Britain and France have declared war, but then nothing much happens on the Western Front for months. The phony war.
Yeah, it's a strange period from about October 39 to May 1940. The term phony war was actually coined by American journalists noticing the lack of major land combat. The French did launch a very limited offensive into Germany's Saar region early on, took a few villages, then stopped and pulled back behind their massive fortifications, the Maginot Line. Their whole military doctrine was defensive, based on World War I experience. They basically sat and waited.
While the Germans, were they just sitting too?
Not entirely. They were busy transferring the bulk of their forces from Poland to the west. They were actively planning Operation Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. It got delayed several times due to bad weather and some arguments among the German generals about the plan, but they were definitely preparing for a major offensive. But while the land war was phony, the war at sea was very real right from the start.
Absolutely. The Battle of the Atlantic began immediately. Britain, being an island, was totally dependent on imports by sea. Germany knew this was a vulnerability. The British Navy suffered some early blows. They lost the aircraft carrier HMS, courageous to a U-boat. And German magnetic mines caused huge problems.
Tell us about those mines. They were a new technology.
Yeah, really nasty. Instead of needing a ship to physically hit them, they were triggered by the magnetic field of a ship passing overhead. It could be dropped by aircraft in shallow harbor entrances and shipping lanes.
In the early months, they were sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate, something like 60 ships in the first few months. Huge amounts of cargo lost weekly. It was a serious crisis for Britain. How did they figure out how to counter them?
Bit of luck and ingenuity. A couple of the mines were dropped on mudflats at low tide and didn't explode. British bomb disposal teams managed to recover them, carefully dismantle them, figure out the magnetic detonator mechanism.
Then they rapidly developed a countermeasure called degaussing, essentially fitting ships with electrical cables that created an opposing magnetic field, neutralizing the ship's signature so it wouldn't trigger the mines. Very clever, very fast work, crucial for survival.
And alongside the U-boats and mines, there were German surface raiders causing trouble too, like the Admiral Graf Spee.
Right, one of Germany's pocket battleships, powerful cruisers designed to outrun anything stronger and outgun anything faster. The Graf Spee had a successful run sinking merchant ships in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean. But in December 1939, she was cornered off the coast of Uruguay by 3 British cruisers in the Battle of the River Plate. The Graf Spee was damaged and forced to take refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo.
And then there's that dramatic end. International law only allowed her a short time in port.
Exactly. Only 72 hours for repairs. The British cleverly used diplomatic channels and fake radio signals to convince the German captain, Hans Langsdorff, that a much larger British force, including battleships and carriers, was waiting just outside the harbor, which wasn't actually true yet. Langsdorff, faced with the prospect of sailing out to certain destruction or being interned for the rest of the war, made a decision.
He scuttled the ship, blew it up himself just outside the harbor.
He did. He saved his crew, who were interned in Argentina, but he didn't want his technologically advanced ship falling into enemy hands. A few days later, Langsdorff, following old naval tradition, wrapped himself in the ship's battle ensign and shot himself in his Buenos Aires hotel room. A tragic end, but the whole episode was a huge morale boost for Britain early in the war.
While the West was in the phony war, the Soviet Union was busy cashing in its chips from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the East. After Poland, they turned to the Baltic states.
Yep. Using diplomatic pressure and the threat of force, Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, essentially forced Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to accept Soviet military bases on their territory. These were the first steps towards their eventual full annexation in 1940. And there's a fascinating detail in the Soviet diplomatic records. Molotov explicitly told his ambassadors in the Baltics not to engage with local communist groups.
Really? Why would he do that? Seems counterintuitive.
It was about perception. They wanted these agreements for bases to look like legitimate, freely negotiated treaties between sovereign states. They didn't want anyone thinking this was a Soviet-backed communist takeover or interference. It was pure power politics masked as diplomacy. They wanted to maintain plausible deniability about their ultimate annexation plans.
Okay, so the Baltics fall into line relatively easily. But Finland was different.
Finland resisted. Stalin made similar demands on them, shifting the border near Leningrad further back, about 40-70 kilometers, to give the city more strategic depth, offering some territory elsewhere in exchange. The Finns, fueled by strong nationalism and deep suspicion of Soviet motives, refused. They weren't willing to give up strategic territory and fortifications.
So diplomacy fails.
Yeah.
What next? Another staged incident.
Exactly. November 26, 1939. The Soviets staged the shelling of Manila, claiming Finnish artillery had fired on Soviet troops near the border, killing several soldiers. It was almost certainly faked by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. They used this as the excuse to break diplomatic relations, renounce their non-aggression pact with Finland, and invade 4 days later on November 30th.
Soviets attacked with massive force, didn't they? They expected a quick victory.
Overwhelming numbers, something like 4 times the number of soldiers, vastly more tanks and aircraft. They thought Finland would collapse in weeks. But the Red Army, weakened by Stalin's recent purges of its officer corps, performed terribly. They were poorly led, poorly equipped for the brutal Finnish winter, and used outdated tactics, basically just trying to advance in long columns down the few roads.
And the Finns fought back incredibly effectively.
Yeah.
Those images of Finnish soldiers on skis.
They were brilliant, highly mobile, knew the terrain, experts in winter warfare. They used these tactics called Madi tactics. Madi is a Finnish word for a bundle of firewood. They'd let the big Soviet columns advance along the roads, then use ski troops to cut them off from behind and attack their flanks, breaking the columns into smaller, isolated pockets, the Madis. Then they just contain these pockets, letting the Finnish winter, starvation, and sniper fire gradually destroy them. They inflicted catastrophic losses on the Soviets, like wiping out the entire 44th Rifle Division.
So the Winter War, despite the huge imbalance in forces, was initially a disaster for the Soviet Union. And this had wider repercussions, didn't it? Especially for how Hitler viewed the Red Army.
Absolutely. Hitler and the German High Command watched the Winter War very closely. Seeing the mighty Red Army struggle so badly against tiny Finland confirmed their prejudice. Hitler famously dismissed the Soviet military as a colossus with feet of clay. This perception of Soviet weakness, based largely on the poor performance in Finland, played a significant role in convincing Hitler that invading the Soviet Union later, in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, would be relatively easy. A fatal miscalculation, as it turned out. #outreport.
So looking back across these 2 decades, it's pretty clear, isn't it? World War II wasn't just one event, one invasion. It was the result of this toxic brew. You had the unresolved anger from Versailles, the failure of the League of Nations to be the peacekeeper it was meant to be, the rise of these incredibly aggressive ideologies like Lebensraum, and then just this series of escalating crises in the 30s where aggression wasn't checked. Appeasement just fed the beast.
Absolutely. It's a grim lesson in what happens when diplomacy fails, when international systems break down, and when aggression isn't confronted early and decisively. But maybe one final thought to leave you with, something that adds another layer of tragedy to it all. Even as Hitler seemed to be riding high, achieving these bloodless victories in Austria, the Sudetenland, internally, within the German system itself, there was deep unease.
You mean within the military, the traditional German generals?
Yes. Figures like the Army Chief of Staff Halder or Beck before him, even commanders like von Brauchitsch or Admiral Canaris, head of military intelligence. They were deeply worried. They repeatedly tried to warn Hitler against his more reckless moves, like invading France when they did. Some were even involved in plots to overthrow him, though they never materialized effectively. They feared Germany wasn't ready for a major war, that Hitler's ambitions would lead to disaster.
And they were also appalled by some of the brutality, weren't they? Even if just for pragmatic reasons.
Some were, yes. We have records, like Halder's diary again, showing Wehrmacht generals complaining about the atrocities the SS were committing in Poland. Not always out of pure morality, perhaps, but because they understood this kind of warfare violated international norms and would ultimately backfire, hardening resistance and guaranteeing retribution. They knew it broke the established rules of conflict they operated under.
So it's this really stark picture. Even as the world was failing to stop Hitler from the outside, people on the inside, the ones who arguably understood the military realities best, knew it was a path to ruin.
Exactly. It suggests the catastrophe wasn't just inevitable because of external factors like appeasement. It was also driven by the internal breakdown of checks and balances within Germany itself, allowing a regime committed to a fundamentally destructive ideology to drag the nation and the world into the abyss. The fact that even some of the key players knew, or at least deeply feared, where it was all heading, that adds another layer of profound tragedy to the whole story.